Hey everyone, welcome. Welcome to the Customer Success webinar series. I'm Scott Slomba, Head of Customer Success at Komprise. With me is Paul Chen, who heads up our product management team. And we have our special guest for a second time, Benjamin Henry, who heads up our architect team. Just a reminder, the intent of these webinar series, it's targeting our existing customers, let you know some of the major new enhancements and features that have come out in Komprise in the past year or so. We've been talking about advanced use cases and just best practices in general. It's not a marketing pitch. It's not a sales pitch. You all own the product. This is just a nuts and bolts conversation about how to make best use of your Komprise subscription. Before we get started, there's a couple logistics. So for those of you who haven't been on here before, in the upper right-hand corner, if you haven't figured it out, I'm not sure what you call this icon, but this will expand the screen to full mode, so that'll give you a better experience. There's also a paper clip on the right-hand side. There's some assets and artifacts that we thought would be helpful for you, so that's there for you. We do want to keep this interactive. With this platform, you're not going to be able to ask questions audibly, but you can ask questions through the chat. So again, on the right-hand side, if you see the question mark, please click that and ask away. We encourage you to ask questions. We'll be monitoring. We'll try and answer what we can in line as we go along, and then we'll have some time at the end to catch anything we didn't cover earlier. People always ask, is this being recorded? Yes, it is. And all the previous sessions were recorded as well. So if you want to go back to those recordings, or if you want to have someone else watch them, if you go to the Customer Success portal, get the link right here, komprise.com/support. If you go to the homepage under announcements, you'll see the links to the previous sessions. I think we have a screenshot at the end of this presentation. The last slide will show you what that looks like. Again, we want to keep this interactive. We're targeting this to be 30 minutes. Depending on the questions and the dialogue we have, we may go longer or shorter. And we're happy to hang out as long as you want. So if you want to stick around long with different additional questions or whatnot, we're here. Today, last week, we talked about performance. Paul walked through some of the enhancements we've done under the hood with Komprise, performance-wise. And Ben talked about some of the best practices, namely around topology in a LAN environment. It's a pretty big topic, so we actually split this session into two. So this week, we're going to focus more on WAN migrations. But before we go there, I just wanted to reiterate that, or remind folks that, Komprise is a software platform that sits on top of existing infrastructure, right? So it sits on top of virtual machines, operating systems, filers, file systems, networking stacks, et cetera, right? If any of these things are non-performant or not configured in the right way, it could impact performance not only in the environment, but it could also impact the performance of Komprise. So in other words, in a lot of cases, the saddle's only got to go as fast as the horse that it's sitting on. And Ben's got a lot of experience in this area, so he's going to walk us through some of the best practices as well as some real life experiences that he's encountered in this regard. Before I turn over to Ben, we did have a couple polls here. So if you click the polling button on the right-hand side of the screen, we had a few questions. We want to get a taste of where you folks are at as far as what you're up to doing migrations and what you're using out there, and that'll help direct the conversation for a bit. So if you could just click on the right-hand side, the polling button, looks like there's a little bar graph there, and then respond to some of those questions. That would help us better focus on the remainder of this conversation.
Scott.
And I'm sorry. Yeah. So actually, I'm not sure. Paul, you seeing results? I'm not seeing results yet. Oh, there we go. All right. People are starting to answer here. Yeah, please. Yeah. Again, please, for those of you who just came on board, just please check the poll screen and answer some of these questions. Thank you. Okay. So with that, I'll let you guys poll away. And then in the meantime, I'll turn it over to Ben.
Awesome. Thanks, Scott. So we're going to dive right into it, and we're talking about best practices and some experiences, real life experiences as well. And one of the first things I always like to talk about is, do you have a plan? The plan is really what's going to help you understand your goals and objectives, but also your peers and leadership. One of the first questions is, if you are doing a migration, is where are you going? And today we're talking more about WAN-based migrations, and a lot of those are probably cloud-based. So you want to consider right away which tier, which cloud, which approach, meaning how are you going to get there? Now that you're taking data outside your four walls, another question that might pop up are, what are the rules and regulations? You want to consider the data types and the workloads and why they might matter. And then the big question is, why is my data movement painfully slow? And the last one being, do I really need to test? And that one might actually answer itself. So let's jump forward here. And this is just to kind of give a demonstration, and there's no one vendor picked over another, but your options are almost endless. There's plenty of places to go. The direction may have been picked for you. You might be tasked with actually picking the direction and the end storage provider. So just to consider, the options are endless, but without a plan, you might kind of get lost in where you want to move your data. Let's jump in the next one, the rules and regulations. The way I like to talk about this is rules are typically
I'm sorry, but
internal.
yeah, sorry to cut in, but yeah, on that note on the previous slide, there's actually two poll questions. So the second one is asking about, what you guys are looking at as far as targets that you're moving data to. So
Well, actually, that's probably a good chance. So let's end the first poll, and we'll start the second poll, and then I'll actually kind of talk a little bit to that. So that's perfect timing. Excellent. And we'll jump forward here while that poll is starting. So the way I like to approach this is rules and regulations. The rules typically are internal to your organization, like what's your retention policy, what's your legal hold, what's your disaster recovery policy. Those are just some samples. Regulations are usually a governing body like Sarbanes-Oxley, HIPAA, MA201, GXP, GDPR. Consider those when you're going to do your migrations outside your four walls, and do they apply? Because sometimes breaking internal rules has some consequences, but breaking regulations can have legal or financial penalties to them. So just keep those in the back of your mind, run them through your compliance team, run them through your legal team. Make sure everything you're doing is all compliant within your organization. Data discovery, this is a great one. So as customers, you have access to gain insights to your data prior to moving by a centralized index. You have an opportunity to standardize permissions. We talk about SMB, NFS, dual, mixed. Mixed is always a dangerous territory, because that's a situation where a share can have two sets of permissions, and one operating system can actually overwrite the other operating system's permissions. You have an opportunity to find those. You have an opportunity to implement data governance based on rules and regulations. We just spoke about those. So you have the ability to find some of that data and say, hey, you know what? I'm going to tag this and put that to the side, because we're going to come back and visit that later. Because let's say I have a petabyte of data to move, and I only found 100 terabytes that might be subject to rules and regulations. So tag it, put it aside, ignore it, and come back to it later on. Identify orphan data. This is actually a very, very common one that I jump into organizations and we talk about is, what do I do, or how do I even identify my orphan data? And most of the times, orphan data is recognized by unresolved SIDs, because those users are no longer around. Why migrate it? Tag it, move it somewhere else, set it aside, have it reviewed, and decide, do you even need that data anymore? Smart data workflows, that's kind of talking about what I just talked about, the moving data that's not required. Tag it, smart data workflows, set it aside, come back to it later. Budget optimization, this is an awesome one. So when you go to do your migrations to cloud vendors, maybe there's an opportunity to go and put your hot data on a higher performing storage and make your internal customers happy, because the data is actually performing the way they want to now. But archive what's not needed. So again, if you've got a petabyte of data, there's a good chance that 64 to 80% of that data is going to be cold. So why move it? Archive it first, move what's hot, pay only for what's needed. Without data discovery, the question I always get is, it's a simple lift and shift, right? Well, is it? Is it going to be simple? If you don't have data discovery, you may not know what you're moving, and you might be introducing a number of speed bumps and hurdles into that process that don't need to be there. We talked about SID resolution issues, regulatory or legal issues, fines, unintended outages, or even performance issues. So moving forward, topology. This is a big one. So the topology is something that I find a number of customers knew at one point in time, or didn't know something changed behind the scenes. It's not uncommon. And you want to start with, any migration or any data movement, just reassess, stop. What is your path? Where are you going? Just simple question. Are you staying in the same site, or are you going between sites or regions? Again, we come back to that question about regulations now. If you're going between sites or even regions, take a look at GDPR and other ones to make sure you're still within the boundaries of those. On-prem to cloud, are you going between cloud providers, or are you bringing some of that data back on-prem? Once you understand or define your path, you then want to understand your path. So define it first, understand it second. Look at your bandwidth. Once you say, okay, I'm going from on-prem to the cloud, what is my connectivity like? Understand your latency. Is there any intrusion detection or intrusion prevention systems, firewalls, antivirus, WAN accelerators? They all can get in the way, and they all can introduce what I like to say is a toll, and you have to pay that toll along the way in latency. And one of the misconceptions that everyone always leadership kind of tends to lean into, and my peers sometimes say, okay, you know what? I'm just going to go and just copy my NAS from local to cloud. It's easy. Just draw a string. Okay, NAS to NAS. This is easy. Not a big deal. Okay, logically, I'm totally on board with that. But going back to what I said earlier, you have to consider all of the hops in that process. What can get in your way? You've got switches, gateways, routers, firewalls, internet service providers. And then when you're inside the internet service provider, how many hops are they taking to get you to your cloud provider? A lot of times you have no control over that when you just leverage a traditional ISP. And actually, that's a good lead into the next slide here. This actually is a business class internet service provider with a customer that was considering in the Bay Area going to AWS West 2 to be their primary area. And one of the issues they had was just data movement, because they said, okay, my ISP, I've got a 1 gig connection out to the world. I'm good to go. So I should be able to use that because it's only 20% used at any given time. So I've got plenty of bandwidth available to do migrations. Okay, well, we saw a lot of issues, a lot of slowdowns. Things weren't moving the way they expected. So we're seeing kind of a maximum of 15.4 megabits per second. That's megabits, not megabytes. So we're talking about extremely slow. We're going back down to almost DSL speeds at this point. Well, why? Let's talk about this. 1 gigabit symmetric connection, 34 milliseconds of round trip latency, and a 64K TCP window. Okay, well, let's just see. Okay, without making any major changes, let's understand, maybe is West 2 the right area for you? So we go over and look at West 1, a little bit closer. So geographically, they're about 500 miles away from West 2. West 1, they're about 60 miles away. So again, we're shortening the distance, speed of light. All right, well, we boost that up to 32.7 megabits. That's not that great of an improvement. They're still not going to be able to move a ton of data in a relatively short order. So let's see, what other optimizations do we have? Well, this was their network. And you can see in the number of hops later on that the ISP was jumping 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 times before we ever got to AWS. So how do we avoid that? What are ways to increase performance? Well, in this situation, it was an AWS Direct Connect. They got a 1 gig AWS Direct Connect that came right from their router out the door through a brokered connection that took them down to 6 milliseconds of round trip latency. In addition to that, we tuned some of the TCP windows, got it to a 4 meg window. Now they boosted their performance to 949 megabits per second. They achieved their goal pretty quickly there. So
hey, Benjamin.
Yeah.
Let me jump in here for a second. I'm looking at the poll and I see that 42% of our responses are people looking to migrate up to AWS. So this seems particularly appropriate to them. That AWS Direct Connect, is there any surcharge, extra charge for that kind of service?
It is a broker connection provided by a third party, but you can get all the information on that through AWS. Just do a quick search on AWS Direct Connect. There's tons of information published right from Amazon on different ways to approach that.
Perfect. And for those of you who've answered our poll, thank you very much. We see that Azure is the second most popular choice for landing Cloudfiler data. But there's a significant portion of you, almost a third, that are saying other, because we've only put sort of the top 3. If you wouldn't mind, could you just put in the question area what other cloud provider you're considering for landing your data? That would be interesting for us. Thank you.
Thanks, Paul. Well, if that slide was applicable to our number 1 poll, then number 2, this will jump right in. So in this situation, we determined we had security appliance interference, and this is a logical diagram of how the customer was configured. Switches, gateway, router, firewall, an IP VPN to the cloud provider, virtual networks, load balancers, several firewalls in the cloud, load balancers to go the opposite direction, virtual networks, and then eventually we landed at the cloud NAS side. But what was unique about this is the storage team knew everything from the cloud provider and to the left. They didn't know everything from the cloud provider to the right because the cloud services were managed by a completely different team. So in doing the surveys and working with the internal network teams, all the right rules were in place, and they were still experiencing less than, we're averaging about 6 megabits or less than 1 megabyte per second. The performance was not optimal, again, when they had a 1 gig VPN. So fast forward, in talking and bringing everyone together, and this is one of the things that I'd like to encourage everyone is during migrations with your plan is always communicate your plan, because who you think might be administering something may not actually be administering the full picture. And that was the case here, where a whitelist was implemented to get around the firewalls and the routers that were the toll booths. They were trying to do stateful packet inspection on data that was already encrypted, which was increasing the load on those systems unnecessarily. So by whitelisting known traffic, we're saying traffic coming from the known local NAS going to the known cloud NAS over our VPN is safe. So it still has to pass through the appliance, but don't attempt to inspect something that's already encrypted that's known. It's a double hit that's not required in that process. So that getting to the VPN drastically increased their performance. But what the actual fix was on the other side, these load balancers and firewalls were managed by the cloud team. So the internal network team said, hey, we're done. We did what we need to do. This should flow. But it's still not. No one could understand until we did a packet trace to figure out that packets were still being dropped at almost a rate of 50%. Later on, the cloud team said, hey, our firewalls are being overloaded. We're not figuring out why. Well, there was a misconfiguration in the load balancers and the firewalls that was essentially dropping the packets. So the cloud team implemented a static NAT route until they could figure out what the misconfiguration was between the load balancers and the firewalls. And then their traffic went to 720 megabits per second sustained. Again, another organization just in communication, talking to the right teams, drastically increased their throughput and achieved their goals in short order. So I think you know where I'm going next. Testing, is it required? Yes, I would always say yes. And it's not just testing your topology. Take a step back and look at the storage on both sides. Is it a legacy NAS that's overloaded, that potentially is running kind of at its limitations right now? Is the destination, was it provisioned with SSD? Was it provisioned with hybrid storage? Was it provisioned with enough IOPS available based on the processor sizes or the machine type that it was built on? There's all different kinds of criteria there that can kind of trip up some of these migrations. So always take a look and start with the source and the destination and make sure they're configured correctly. Does the technology have a limitation where if it has anything approaching 1 million files, will it drastically slow down because it can't respond because it's experiencing disk thrashing? Does it enforce short names that are actually causing you to rename your files? Does it support long names, Unicode characters versus non-Unicode characters? All of those can lead to severe performance decreases in migrations. Let me go back to testing your topology. How can you test it very easily? Just start with a simple ping. Can you at least get to it? And don't be surprised in a ping if the firewall is blocking the ping. That's very common, but at least attempt it. Do an NS lookup. What is can you resolve the DNS? Like, is it available through naming, or can you only use IP to get around? Trace routing. This will right away tell you how many hops you're taking and give you an average of latency that you're seeing through that process. And it's a great way to use that screenshot of a trace route output to go to your peers and say, hey, am I taking the right route? And it's not uncommon if you're not hitting the express route, you're not hitting the direct connect, but that trace route should immediately tell someone in the networking team, hey, is this correct or not? You can run iPerf, Wireshark. Wireshark, I say it's not just for experts. Wireshark is an excellent tool. It can be very overwhelming, but right away, the most basic thing Wireshark will tell you, are you experiencing dropped packets? Because those will show up in red and black text. And if you're flooding the Wireshark log with red and black text with drop, retry, retransmit, that's an issue. Something is either bottlenecked or it's forcefully dropping your packets because it's not letting that traffic through. And then ACE. I'm going to talk about it a little bit more, but this is an assessment of customer environment where we can help existing customers identify bottlenecks before they even move. So again, test early, test often, and then also test your migrations. Offer incentives to try to get a partnering team to say, hey, you know what? You're the first one up. Let's get you over here. I'm going to put you on all flash storage, but I'm going to archive your data first to afford that new flash storage. That way you get the highest performing storage for being an early adopter of this migration.
Hey,
Benjamin.
Okay.
Go ahead, Scott. Go ahead, Scott.
Yeah, so Benjamin, I was hoping you could comment on moving data from a source NAS to a destination, but also the opposite direction. Are they always the same or are they different?
I mean, going from a cloud provider back on-prem again?
Correct.
Yeah, so again, that's actually largely the process would be similar, but there I'm going to go back to my first category under testing, source and target. And there you're definitely going to need to check to see over that process, maybe someone's changed the machine type, changed the service level. Make sure that you're optimized to move the data the way your organization is asking. Make sure, again, do you have the number of IOPS that are required? Do you have the machine type that's required? Does that machine type have the network capabilities to move data based on your topology? It's not uncommon for someone to go through and right size something, a cloud administrator to go into a sub account and say, you know what, our bill's way too expensive. I'm going to reduce the quality of service or reduce the machine type that these services are using to get the bill where we need it. And I'm going to put it there until someone screams, and then we'll kind of move those machine types around when that person screams saying, hey, I'm not getting the performance, I'm slowing things down, I'm costing the company money. So it's not uncommon for those things to change over time. So always go back and look to see if you're configured optimally for moving large volumes of data.
Yeah. Well, the reason why I asked the question too is I've run into a situation where like firewall settings where data going out of the organization, it's like wide open, hey, go out there. But coming back in, it's scrutinized much more heavily, which takes time and slows things down.
Very, very good point. There's actually a couple of firewall vendors out there. Meraki is notorious for this, where outbound connections, when you establish an outbound connection, there's no ability to set, when I send data out, I want these rules. When I send data back, I want these rules. Or what Meraki does is it says, I will allow the same connections and ports that it went out to come back on. So you'd have to go into that specific firewall or that appliance to create an inbound rule only. So there are some situations where the customer might be configured optimally to send data out, but then, as you said, heavily scrutinized, but only allow a small portion or a lower bandwidth traffic back in, meaning you might have a 10 gig pipe coming out, but then on the reverse, you might only have a 1 gig pipe coming back in. So again, it goes back to topology. You always want to look at that. How is your network configured? How are your appliances configured? And can you move data over them? So again, it's about partnering, talking, communication within your organization. Let everyone know you're like turn signals. Turn signals signal your intent to make a turn. So by communicating, you're signaling your intent. And if you don't hear a horn, then it must be okay at that point because no one's saying anything. But if someone's sounding a horn saying, hey, what about? It's an opportunity to listen to avoid running into something. Paul, I think you had a question as well.
Yeah, I was going to jump in, Benjamin. On those technology limitations, that's a pretty high-level list, somewhat generic, but I know there are actual, not to point out names, but there are actual vendors out there that have these issues. For example, I think the 1 million files, isn't there a specific brand that recommends having fewer than that number of files in a directory?
Yeah, most NAS vendors recommend around 100,000 files. There is one large vendor that says, again, it's a published paper they have out there that says we recommend no more than 100,000 in a directory. When you approach 500,000, there could be some performance issues. When you approach 1 million, it will actually, it has the capability of shutting down one of those nodes in the cluster.
And I know we've had customers come to us because they're trying to run migrations and they're seeing slowness. They're not sure our support gets in there. Our own analysis, again, the Komprise analysis that we provide can show you which directories have large numbers of files. And so it was pretty easy to point out to them what was going on in those cases, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, that might be a great thing for follow-up, is demonstrating the native capabilities that when you analyze data, there's one tab that will go down and tell you here's the percentage and the number of shares that have over 100,000 files in those directories. So you can take that into consideration and maybe look a little further into it to see if you might run into some of those technology limitations. Oh, absolutely.
Thank you.
All right, and then the last slide here, we were talking about testing. ACE, we've talked about this before. Assessment is customer environment. We have a number of individuals that are trained in this. And what we do is it's a script that will go out, and we're going to test from point A to point B and see how long it takes to move certain file sets over that topology. And based on the results and the timing, we can it gives us some clues as to what might be a bottleneck in the environment, and to help the customer have a conversation with their peers to say, hey, you know what? Do we have an asymmetric route? Because I can read a 100 meg file faster than a 1K file. Or repeatedly, we're seeing categories of timings that's taking much longer than another because we might be dropping files because we're taking a different route. So there's ways that we can help guide customers to have the conversations to say to our peers, is there anything else we can do to increase performance? And those two customer examples I showed earlier are customers where we ran ACE to help them identify where the bottlenecks were. And as we saw, they had a very, very successful outcome. All right, Scott, back to you.
Well, if anybody would like to have ACE run in their environment, don't hesitate to reach out to your CSM and we can get that going for you. So what you have here is here's the screenshot I talked about earlier. So again, this is going to be recorded, and the previous sessions were recorded. So again, if you go to the support portal under announcements, you'll see the link to the webinar series and the links to the previous recordings or sessions. And then wrapping up here with the last 2 minutes, we would like to do more of these. They seem to be pretty heavily attended. People are sticking around for quite a while. We're looking to squeeze in another session, maybe 2, before the end of the year. And we would like to get your feedback on topics. So again, you don't have audio here. So if you could just click on the question mark button and type in topics that you'd like to hear more about. We can double back and go deeper on some topics we already talked about. If there's anything we haven't talked about that you're interested in, let us know. If just the standard use cases, we're happy to walk through anything. Again, the purpose of this webinar series is for you, our existing customers, to make best use of your subscription. So we're happy to double back and do anything. So I'll just leave, just the last minute or 2, please, take a few seconds and just jot down anything else you'd like to hear about. So far, we're getting silence, which means I think we hit everything of interest, Paul. Oh, here we go. Oh, that's responding to one of the other destinations is Dell. Paul, do you have any suggested topics you're thinking of that you might want to bring up? See if you get feedback from the group here.
Well, we can definitely cover analysis, what Komprise can do for you on the analysis side. A lot of the things that Ben talked about earlier about figuring out the smart migration, what data is cold, what data is unowned, zombie data, how do I move that? We can help you figure that out. So we can discuss Komprise analysis. We could also talk about plan. We haven't talked about that very much in these series yet, but how to effectively use the plan to archive data or even copy or confine data.
Okay.
Actually, looks like there was a topic in there, future discussions, breakdown on the analytics. Perfect.
Yeah, that would be a good topic. We just came up with a new analytics guide. I think we promoted it on the last few sessions. Yeah, really nice job with a really nice comprehensive breakdown of how it all works. But that could be a good working session coming up. So if we don't get other feedback, we may do that next time. Okay, if there's no further questions or feedback, thank you for the time. We'll wrap this up and look for the next session coming up in a couple weeks. Thank you.
Thank you all.